Hey, welcome to part 3 of Advanced Psychoproctology for Beginners. In part 2, I aim to motivate you to home in on a more accurate diagnosis of butthead behavior. Remember my question, what distinguishes a butthead, since it can't just be that you happen to butt heads with them. Here I'll give you a sense of my diagnosis so far and how I came to it, always open to revision. Where I come from matters. I have my personal biases, right? Where I stand on butthead diagnosis will be influenced by where I sit in my life and how I got there, where I've gotten my affirmations over my lifetime and how that affirmation could distort my attempts at a neutral diagnosis. For you to kick the tires on my diagnosis, it's good for you to know where I'm coming from. I work in science and philosophy, though I consider it serious play rather than a chore. My affirmation comes from having work for which I have infinite patience. I love this shit. I feel lucky to have the appetite, aptitude, and opportunity to do what I do, which isn't to say what I do is right. You're perfectly entitled to decide I don't know what I'm talking about, and anyway, I don't get to claim I do. If I were way off, I'd probably be the last to know or admit to it. People think of science as unbiased. I see it as heavily biased against personal bias. Of course, we all have biases. Again, where we stand depends on where we sit. Still, science overall is cooperation and competition between researchers attempting to put their personal biases aside to understand what's really going on. I think of science as to get what you want, you have to set aside what you want long enough to see what is. Better informed, you'll be more effective in getting what you want. In my psychoproctology work, I really want to stop buttheads of all kinds. For that, I have to try to set aside my biases and prejudices to better understand what's really up with them. For example, I don't want to be distracted by the self-affirming joys of righteous indignation, which I know well. Yeah, I hear myself get giddy when gossiping about dipshits. I used to be bugged by the term philosophy, which in Greek means love of wisdom. What kind of name is that for an area of research? Every unwise butthead can claim they love wisdom, and most do. Philosophy should be called sophology, right? The study of wisdom, what it is and how to get it. Recently, I realized, though, that to do philosophy right, you have to love wisdom more than you love yourself. Getting giddy about your genius isn't good philosophizing. As Piet Hein, a playful philosopher, scientist, role model of mine, put it, philosophers find their true perfection, knowing the follies of humankind by introspection. I'm susceptible to the follies of humankind. If I'm going to prefer wisdom to my self-love, I have to admit that I get giddy, just like an alcoholic has to admit they find booze appealing. Lifelong, I've loved nonsense as a way to learn about wisdom. As a kid, I became infatuated with Lewis Carroll's mind. He was a logician who also wrote nonsense fiction and poetry. I get that. See, I collect positive role models, but also negative ones. Role models for what I don't want to become like, knowing that I have the potential to become like them. My mantra has long been, I wouldn't put it past me. Psychoproctology is the study of anti-wisdom. I study the difference between sense and nonsense, wise and unwise, the people I can learn from in opposite directions. How to do better, how to do worse. Trumpists are negative role models for me. Unwise people I figure I could become like, but don't want to. I have to remember I could become like them without me noticing, just as Trumpists don't notice that they have become that way. Again, if I were full of shit, I'd probably be the last to notice. To me, Trump is the quintessential celebrity king of anti-wisdom. In a way, he's a dark dream of mine come true. Decades ago, I noticed that folks were pretty vague on the difference between wise and unwise. I thought maybe what we needed an absurdly obvious negative role model for pure, quintessential anti-wisdom. Someone so generically unwise that you couldn't mistake him for anything else. I thought maybe that would wake people up. I even made up a theology about it. Trump as the second coming. I'm an atheist, but I like making up religions. See, I thought maybe a blatant dumbass celebrity would finally make being unwise so obvious it would help inoculate society against unwisdom. Yeah, I knew the inoculation could end up spreading the disease of unwiseness. Maybe their brain fart would snuff us out before we could snuff it out. Well, be careful what you wish for. We got him, and his appeal is stronger than I expected. But I get it. Like I said, I know what it's like to giddy gloat, gossiping about my enemies the way Trumpists do. I get the appeal. I do study sophology, trying to understand what wisdom is. Buttheads are unwise. I consider psychoproctology to be the negative half of sophology, like nonsense is to logic. Since any fool can claim to love wisdom, I have to be careful. You'll find a lot of charismatic authorities on YouTube and elsewhere who will lay down the law on unwise behavior. They'll tell you what makes someone a narcissist, a cultist, or whatever. They'll give you examples that might ring true to you. That approach no longer rings true for me, for a reason I mentioned in my last video. It's impressionistic and abstract. It's fun building those abstract, impressionistic models and theories. You can lend them the air of religious, spiritual, scientific, or philosophical authority. You feel like a genius when you've got one, especially if it gets popular. You get downright giddy about the fools that just don't get your genius. Decades back, I had my abstract impressionist model too. Mine was spiritual flavored, the usual popular liberal stuff. And then, during a midlife crisis, my model wasn't up to the challenges I was dealing with. I could have swapped it for another abstract impressionist model, but I ended up wanting something more grounded. I didn't want to just swap my dogma for another dogmatism. But if you aren't going to do that abstract impressionistic theorizing, what else is there? I figured our best guesses were likely to come from science, biological evolution in particular. In retrospect, I'd say I turned my curiosity towards what I'd call Biosophology, the study of what wisdom is from the ground up, the ground being the wisdom of biological adaptations. You know, the wise behavior of organisms, the ability to change their behavior depending on their changing circumstances. Around that time, I lucked into working closely with an unusual scientist, Terrence Deacon, a neuroscientist / evolutionary biologist / biological anthropologist. He was teaching at Harvard when I met him and happened to move to UC Berkeley shortly after I got my PhD with him. Not at Harvard, but with him willing to be on my PhD committee at a podunk college anyway, because he's that kind of guy. Terry didn't care that I didn't have much academic status. I was curious. We've been curious together for 30 years now. I take long dog walks with him, maybe 5 days a week, working out our curiosities together. He's very different from me by temperament. He's way more polite than I am. He doesn't like the name I gave my book, What's Up with Assholes. Still, our conversations inform my work in psychoproctology. I'll jump ahead here for a minute to say I do have my guess about what wisdom actually is. To me, it's like the quest suggested by the Serenity Prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept what I can't change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I've written over 100 articles about that formula, including lots of variations that deal with the tough judgment calls we all deal with. And by all I mean other organisms too, for some of these tough judgment calls. Critters also have to be able to distinguish between what they can and can't change. For example, the adaptive utility of beavers' teeth for changing trees into beaver dams, and their fur for protecting them against the cold weather, which they can't change. Even without thoughts and feelings, critters accumulate wisdom to know the differences that make a difference. But wisdom to know is sloppy. It's weird. Which is it, wisdom or knowledge? I think of it as the wisdom to want to notice the differences that make a difference in how we respond to changing circumstances. Wisdom is the quest itself, not to some God who knows. I'm an atheist. No, wisdom is the motivation to keep trying to adapt, to stay curious, to keep learning. For example, to keep ever questing for better knowledge, better habits, about when to muster serenity to stop trying to improve something versus the courage to keep trying to improve it. Wisdom is the courage to never give up on trying to improve your capacity to notice the differences that make a difference. It's the opposite of that giddy gloating that I or the Trumpists get, as if we've already got the formula, as if we've solved reality, nothing left to learn. Now, not all organisms can learn, most simply accumulate adaptive habits in evolution's trial and error process. All living beings are trying to stay alive. Not all are trying to learn how to survive better. Animals learn, and especially human animals, because we have language. When I met Terry, he had just completed a 20-year neuroscience research project attempting to explain how humans ended up with language and how it makes us a very different kind of critter. He had just turned his attention to a bigger question: how chemistry ended up becoming living beings struggling for their own existence. Not the usual consciousness studies impressionistic abstractions. No, he had to explain how living beings struggling to regenerate themselves ever emerged within nothing but physical chemistry, which everywhere in the universe tends toward degeneration. In other words, order always tends to get mixed up. Order degenerates. Throw a box of aligned toothpicks into water and they'll fall out of alignment and dissipate. Well, living beings don't. For close to 4 billion years, organisms have kept themselves in working order, regenerating themselves faster than they would otherwise degenerate. How did our struggle for existence emerge within nothing but physical chemistry? The answer isn't evolutionary theory. The struggle for existence is what evolves. Darwin knew that. He assumed the struggle for existence. It was very clear that he hadn't explained it. DNA replication doesn't explain it either. Sure, we can imagine that genes are selfish, just like we can imagine that a river wants to get to the sea. We can pretend DNA has some imaginary substance in it, like a soul that's trying to get itself copied, but it's a fucking molecule, not trying to do anything. Terry and we fellow researchers have a working physical model for how living beings struggling for their own existence emerged and started evolving. We have a model for how everything evolved from that ground up. DNA, multicellularity, nervous systems, and language. All the bells and whistles. How is our question, not why it would be useful, not what it is in some abstract impressionistic description. We have an explanation. It could be wrong, but at least we've got one. This is going to sound pompous. From what I can tell, I'm one of the only social scientists who can actually explain what a motivation is in strictly physical terms, starting with the motivation to struggle for our own existence. Most researchers just assume motivation in their abstract impressionistic models. If you see effort, assume a motivation, which is no more scientific than if you see effort, assume a soul or spirit. Naming is not explaining. Here's my Google talk explaining the challenge of producing a non-impressionistic, non-abstract explanation for how it all happens, and our best guess at how it does. And yup, that's my grounding for psychoproctology. So here goes my diagnosis. First, being an a-hole, butthead, or whatever you want to call them, is a human thing. It's a tempting option for any of us. Pretty much all critters are parasites and predators preying on other critters. But that's not the same as being an asshole. An asshole has language by which to self-idealize, rationalize, moralize, do whatever to get what they want. How we evolve feelings and language is more than I can address here, because good Lord, does this boy ever shut up? But the psychoproctology takeaway is that language makes us an unusually anxious species. With language, we can conceive of all manner of real and imaginary past, present, and future threats and missed opportunities. We're all trudging through a sandstorm of mojo-eroding possibilities and inevitabilities like aging and death. If you were ever freaked out, well, no wonder. Other critters have it easier. Having language is enough to fry our brains and perhaps eventually our entire species. Language enables humans to imagine infinities. No cat, let alone plant, can conceive of infinity. Humans can imagine infinite good, the ideal. We can see where we fall short. We can self-horrify by imagining that we're infinitely bad. and we can self-idealize that we're infinitely good. A cat or plant isn't capable of imagining heaven and hell, those fantasy supernatural residencies where you'll spend infinite time enjoying infinite pleasure or suffering infinite pain for being infinitely good or infinitely bad in the eyes of an infinitely right, righteous, and mighty God. That's human shit we couldn't begin to do without language. Okay, but I have yet to ground this story in the origins of life. So here's a taste of how I go from the origins of life to what's up with assholes. Again, all organisms have to regenerate themselves faster than they'd otherwise degenerate. That takes energy, but here's the thing. Energy doesn't regenerate things. A fire or hurricane doesn't build houses, it destroys them. That means organisms have to interact selectively with their environments, taking in the energy that they can use to regenerate themselves, not the energy that would degenerate them. You know, you eat food, not poison. Drink water, not bleach. Apply that to humans with our feelings and thoughts. What do you get? You get confirmation bias. We're all more inclined to take in concepts that regenerate rather than degenerate our confidence. Ideas that affirm us, not the ones that disaffirm us. That's a challenge for all of us, me included. For example, I speed read hate mail. I'm tempted to ignore discouraging words. So here's a fundamental distinction I'd make between decent folks and buttheads. Decent folks know that their confirmation bias is their problem to manage. Buttheads treat confirmation bias as the solution to all of their problems. And I do mean all. We all jerk people around a bit in our effort to deflect challenges to our self-confidence. A total jerk is absolutely close to discouragement. They deflect all challenges and declare themselves right, righteous, and mighty no matter what. They may not do it about everything with everyone the way Trump does. Maybe they're just absolutists on some topic or with some people like their abused partners. But where they do it, they're absolute about it. Confirmation bias is the solution to all of their problems. That's why they're hella dangerous. Not because they disagree with you or me, but because reality is unimpressed by their proud, blind faith in their absolute authority. Still, I get why they'd be tempted by that proud, blind faith. What do you get when you cross feelings with language? You mostly get language that makes us feel good. In absolutists, or you could say assolutists, it gets way out of hand. Zero curiosity. Absolutely no curiosity. In the next video, I thought I'd turn my attention to treatment, how to deal with assholes. But I've decided to talk about prevention first. How to both exercise and regulate this universal human temptation toward absolute confirmation bias, toward that proud, blind, absolutist, Trump-like faith in ourselves, as if we can simply trump reality with our self-idealizations. How to exercise yet regulate that self-flattering crush on ourselves that crushes all curiosity about what we really are. Thanks for hanging in here. This was a lot. I told you it takes some humbling work to wonder harder what's up with assholes. And again, you don't have to agree with me, of course. I might not agree with myself in a few months. I think of curiosity as curating one's assumptions, deciding which to keep and swap, and deciding where you're not sure what you believe yet. It's not being open-minded. Like they say, I'd like to keep an open mind, but I don't want my brains to spill out. Wisdom to notice the differences between what you still believe, a better belief, and a question you're still working on. Thank you.